Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. Welcome to the Royal Academy of Music. It occurs to me I might be the only person here who's equally interested in all of the components of today's session, which is not a demonstration of the instruments nor a concert as such. Instead, as I hope the title at least suggests, it's an exploration through the medium of a framed concert of what a cello is. Instead of calling it the inner life of the cello, I might have chosen a social life, or something rather more conceptual like the thing knowledge of Davis Baird's philosophy of scientific instruments. I apologize for reading this text, but it's the only way I'm going to safely cover the material I've got to cover, and I also want to leave my head in the right place to play, which will be the middle of the event. One of the fundamental points I want to make is that ontological questions about the cello can't be adequately addressed in words. However, in order for this to make sense as a whole, I do need to set a context, and the first part of the event, first half hour or so, will be a presentation of a series of perspectives on our understanding of what an instrument is, gradually focusing in on some of the unique qualities of the cello. I'll then briefly introduce Michael Finnissy's piece, and Zubin Kanga and I will play the 7 pieces that make up the Ricercari without interruption, in as far as the stage management of using all of those will allow. I just hope I don't trip. We trust that the first 2 parts of the event will raise a lot of questions, and we'll pick up some of the things that interest us in a 3-way conversation at the end, and there'll also be an opportunity for questions from the floor, unless my time management goes badly wrong. Special thanks to Michael Finnissy, who's with us today, to Zubin Kanga, who's come in to join me, to Barbara Meyer, the custodian of the instrument collection, who's helped with organizing all of these, and to the 3 students who have instruments on loan, who brought them in at 1 o'clock today so that we could have them, Margarita Balanas, Raffaele Ottonello, and Josh Salter. When Helmut Lachenmann claimed in 1986 that composing can be taken to mean building an instrument, he was indicating a sense of belonging to a long tradition, as well as highlighting some peculiar aspects of his own practice, which I'm not going to talk about. Stravinsky goes further in an interview in the 1950s, expressing the composer's responsibility in extremis. This is Stravinsky. Instruments are nothing in themselves. The literature they play creates them. The mandolin and guitar, for instance, did not exist until Schoenberg imagined them in an entirely new way in his Serenade. A new musical masterpiece of that kind is a demand that musicians be created to play it. He was obviously in a funny mood that day. Over a century earlier, Berlioz also places the composer at or as the source in his grand treatise on instrumentation, with the almost Cajun observation. It's the very beginning of the book. Every sounding object employed by the composer is a musical instrument. However, Berlioz is unlikely to have meant that in its fullest sense, and he was in fact keen to explore the innate qualities of musical instruments, observing that the study of quality of tone, timbre, particular character, and powers of expression pertaining to each instrument has been hitherto much neglected. Behind this lies an implicit acknowledgement of a complex relationship between musical idea and realization that is strikingly and also peculiarly captured by Morton Feldman in an interview from 1967. And this is Feldman. I like instruments that have a certain anonymous quality, that can easily metamorphose themselves to enter the musical world. If you really want to know the truth, instruments embarrass me. I hear a sound, an instrument makes it, the instrument changes it, gives it its own color, destroys its abstract quality or its reality. He was obviously in a funny mood as well. The innate qualities of instruments to which Berlioz and Feldman are pointing are rich and complex, and the kinds of insider knowledge that musicians bring to bear on their understanding, utilization, and, if we take Feldman seriously, even mitigation, is neatly illustrated by the English composer Cecil Forsyth, who makes the brief observation in his orchestration book of 1914 that the difference between B-flat and A clarinets, which we understand as different instruments, is a good deal less than the difference between a Brescian and a Cremonese violin, which we understand as the same instrument. We might wonder how many composers today would have made that kind of timbral comparison by citing the two great centers of violin making at the beginning of the instrument's history. So it's worth knowing that Forsyth was a viola player, and that Brescian instruments have long been vastly more popular with violists than violinists or cellists. For those who aren't instrument cognoscenti, the Brescian makers produce instruments that are often dark sounding, which is one of the reasons the viola players love them, and the Cremonese, brighter, more silvery ones. That's very crude. But those timbral qualities also happen to be intimately related to the way the instruments look. Put crudely, the Cremonese instruments are archetypically classical, and the Brescian instruments rather Gothic. And we'll return to that opposition of types later. Perhaps the greatest challenge in articulating any kind of ontology of musical instruments is that Stravinsky and Lachermann are presenting only part of the picture. And there's in fact a very complex multi-directional building of instruments in which all of the component streams have complex lives in their own quasi-private worlds as well as in relationship. And it's interesting that I found myself starting by talking about composers because they exist in a public realm in the way that players' relationships with instruments tend not to, and makers tend not to. The instrument maker, the literal builder of the thing, knows nothing of the music that will be written for it, and may know very little of what already exists. His or her dialogue will be with other makers, and to a certain extent with players. We have almost no records of maker-player discussions, because of the private way in which these are largely conducted. The composer, on the other hand, is likely to be in much more intimate dialogue with other composers' building of instruments than with makers. Sometimes performers can be very present in this, but equally we might be rather ghostly figures hovering in the wings. Explicit dialogue between composers and makers is quite unusual. There are interesting cases through history. And implicit dialogue between them is more often than not completely out of time. In the pieces we'll play later, Michael Finnissy makes this part of the subject of his composition, and I can't help but make it part of my performance. But more often than not, it is ignored. It's often simply too convenient for composers to treat actual instruments as means to ends. The performer's position, though, is perhaps the most complex. We too are engaged in building instruments, but this building process is much more difficult to grasp. It spans a lifetime and is difficult to extract any kind of object, thing, as a manifestation. The instrument a player builds necessarily escapes the bounds of the repertoire that it's used to play and the physical thing that is used for making the sounds, even though these also remain as absolutely vital elements within it. It's this context that lies behind the great Russian virtuoso Nathan Milstein's according a special importance to the advice his teacher Leopold Auer gave him: think or practice, and I love the fact Milstein uses those two interchangeably. Practice with your head and not your hands. Thus, the cello I play is not the instrument that Pablo Casals played, or even today those played by Margarita Balanas, Raffaele or Josh. Although Amit Peled from Peabody is now playing the Gafrilla cello that Casals used for 60 years, he can't play Casals' cello as I mean it here. In fact, my instrument might be somewhat closer to Casals because I've been fascinated by his particular cellistic approach for years and have slowly found ways of incorporating some of those tools in my own arsenal. The technical tools and the physical thing are just elements of this shared construction that is the instrument. However, they can't easily be separated out. They, like the maker's dialogues or the composer's dialogues, exist to a certain extent in their own worlds, but also in various kinds of dialogues that can be almost impossible to access. And this is what I mean in the title by the inner life of the cello. Because we've got so many things to look at today, it's interesting to realize that they are just pointing to something that we can't see. For today, I want to put dealers, auction houses, museums, even collections such as the one which has allowed this event to take place to the side. even though they too make a powerful contribution to our understanding of instruments. And this is especially the case for the violin family. Although there are universal aspects to the player-maker-composer relationships through which we construct instruments, the violin family presents a few distinctive features, of which the fact that most high-level professionals are using antique objects for their daily work is among the most striking. That there is a rich and reflexive relationship between people and the instruments they play, or the voice types they embody, that extends even to modes of dress and behavior, is obvious to anyone who's worked in a conservatoire or played in an orchestra. For all sorts of perfectly good reasons, this hasn't been very thoroughly investigated. But the use of antique objects by string players comes up frequently as something that shapes our interactions with the world. For a young player attempting to carve out a niche in a difficult profession, it can feel like it would be very helpful to work with something that suggests a certain kind of provenance, which is one reason why instruments often feature in biographies. And from a personal standpoint, the right kind of old instrument can sometimes prove a worthwhile financial investment. In recent years, some interesting research has been done by Claudia Fritz and an extensive team claiming to present a striking challenge to near-canonical beliefs about old Italian violins. No attempt has been made to establish the existence of these beliefs, which are accepted as a commonplace. The research was very well planned and executed, and through a number of studies, the team reported the finding that experienced players tended to prefer the new instruments and were unable to distinguish old from new at better than chance levels. Let's take that outcome at face value for a moment. Could it mean that playing on an important instrument is merely a branding exercise? Or could it be a kind of projection of something else, an investment strategy? Why do we ascribe special qualities to old instruments, and what kinds of qualities might these be? Rather than raise issues with Fritz's methodology, which is both careful and thorough, it's interesting to look at the framing of the exercise. The unchallenged notion of the purported tonal superiority of old Italian violins may indeed be claimed by many players, but the claim might actually mean something quite different, as some kind of necessary fiction. There are two obvious problems with taking the claim for granted. The one which presents itself first is that musicians are not, by and large, able to find adequate language to describe anything much about what we do. The second, which lies behind the first, is that the specific kind of understanding we have of our instruments is a material knowledge and not a language-centered one. The fundamental task Fritz and her team put to the experienced, high-level players who participated in the second, the more probing study, was outwardly pragmatic but conceptually difficult. Imagine you're looking for a violin to replace your own for recitals and concerto performances in an upcoming tour. As part of the process, players were asked to score the instruments in terms of loudness under the ear, estimated projection, playability, tone quality, articulation/clarity, and overall preference/quality. I can say categorically that I don't feel I'd be able to score the instruments I'm about to play very effectively in any of those categories. And although I'd happily play the game of which one I'd take with me on my imaginary tour, I'm keenly aware that that would be exactly that again. And that would probably bear very little relation to the things that might matter to me in the long term. What we have in those studies is a kind of category confusion, which of course has been prompted by what we as players say, in which an instrument is treated as if it were a tool. Even in the sciences, where this understanding of instruments has been habitual, this is now being questioned. It's very difficult indeed to articulate what makes a particular instrument interesting, and I'm not even going to try today. So most descriptions from players read like bad marketing speak. If we accept that we exist in very complex relationships with our instruments, then it possibly makes more sense to think of them as partners rather than tools. It's quite an interesting proposition to imagine those Fritz experiments as dating scenarios. I played the same old Italian cello for over 25 years before acquiring my current instrument, which I'm obviously not going to play today. It was quite difficult psychologically to say goodbye to my cello after that time, and given that I owned it for only about a 12th of its lifetime, I have perhaps no right ever really to have thought of it as mine. But it's also been exciting and challenging to develop a new relationship, and there's one of the real excitements about what's going to happen today. Curiously, I found that my wife, who's an artist and also a musician, was much more immediately insightful than I was while I was looking for my new partner. One comment that stayed with me was that she described an early concert with the instrument I now play as a fair fight. I'm reasonably confident she meant that positively, as the previous instrument was a little bit easier to dominate, but it wouldn't be difficult to find a less encouraging reading. Charles Beer has recounted the great Russian virtuoso Gregor Piatigorsky telling him, and Beer goes to the trouble of saying, with a straight face, that as he was about to play a concerto feeling on absolutely tremendous form, a small, still voice coming from the peg box of his wonderful Stradivarius said to him, "Who do you think you are?" And I think that kind of... we'll come back to him in a minute. I think one of the other things I just want to say very briefly now, I think I learned vastly more about these instruments from playing Michael's music on them than I did from the kind of testing or experiments I did when I first tried them in the workshop. And that was surprising to me. Well, I don't really know why. Maybe we'll pick that up in the interview. In a recent French collection of essays exploring ideas around the musical instrument, Jacques de Witt sketches an erotic dimension to our relationship with both music and instruments. The invocation of an element of seduction in the drawing out of the potential of materials in art has a long history, which can perhaps help us better understand Morton Feldman's embarrassment with instruments. Gregor Piatigorsky again, who had the opportunity many times to play two of the greatest Stradivari cellos, which were at the time kept next to one another in Horace Havermeyer's apartment in New York. This is the Bata, which is the one that's currently in the Metropolitan Museum, and the Dupont, which Rostropovich played. He's written that it's very important to have a beautiful instrument that inspires the player. Actually, he must be in love with his instrument. De Witt doesn't have much to say about players, but he calls on Stravinsky's defense of his rather naughty treatment of the original 18th century material in Pulcinella to help make his case. This is Stravinsky. People who had never heard of or cared about the originals cried sacrilege. The classics are ours. Leave the classics alone. To them all, my answer was and is the same. You respect, but I love. In fact, Stravinsky wanted at least something of this love reciprocated by the performer, as he makes clear in his Poetics of Music, where he claims the difference in makeup between an executant and an interpreter, in the strict sense of the word, is of an ethical rather than aesthetic order. As he puts it, one can only require of the executant the translation into sound of his musical part, whereas one has the right to seek from the interpreter, in addition to that perfection of translation, a loving care. And it could only be a kind of passionate love rather than respect that would have allowed someone to authorize and commit the acts of violence that cut down the astonishingly beautiful, still rather voluptuous Ruggieri that's been living in the case on the instrument gallery and is there behind me, slightly behind a few others. But would allow someone to cut that down to the proportions of an archetypal cello. It's been seriously hacked at, very skillfully hacked at. Perhaps this can help us understand why, towards the end of a composition in which Nathan Milstein emphasizes the centrality of invention for the performer, he makes an outwardly simple but still somewhat shocking observation that I love to tell students here. It comes across both as a quasi-private confession, but also as a fundamental truth. You know, I love the violin more than I love music. It's one of those things that as musicians, we're almost not, in fact, maybe we're not allowed to say. So it's wonderful to hear him say it. I turn now to the cello itself. It appears as part of the violin family quite suddenly in the 16th century. Looking backwards, it almost seems as if the family arrived fully formed. So it's important to remember that the archetypes that have been most influential in its long history belong largely to the 18th century, the early 18th century. And to imagine that time gap, we might think of the history of the car or the plane, for which the equivalent period has not yet elapsed. I'm not going to claim any special expertise in the reading of that emergence, but I want to make a case that it must have been at least as much a social, cultural, and aesthetic process as a technological one. In fact, we know shockingly little of the kinds of actual personal and material interactions that gave birth to the instruments we've since taken as representatives of the ideal, and less still of the very earliest examples. Got a slight diversion here, but I'll be back to instruments in a moment. At the beginning of Kenneth Clarke's classic monograph from the 1950s, The Nude, a study in ideal form, he observes that the English language with its elaborate generosity distinguishes between the naked and the nude. To be naked is to be deprived of our clothes, and the word implies some of the embarrassment most of us feel in that condition. The word nude, on the other hand, carries in educated usage no uncomfortable overtone. The vague image it projects is not of a huddled and defenseless body, but of a balanced, prosperous, and confident body, the body reformed. The essential point is not merely that the nude represents a different conception of the state of being without dress, but also that it's a construction in a way that nakedness is not. Hence Clarke's subtitle, this study in ideal form. So Clarke sees the nude as an art form rather than an art subject, which was invented in the 5th century BC by the Greeks, just as opera was invented in the 17th century by Italians. It's not strictly a representative art form, but a complex interrelation between certain ideals of proportion and design, certain geometrical principles, and an absolutely necessary degree of depiction. Above all, he observes, we do not wish to imitate, we wish to perfect. I'm not going to give a kind of explication of a Platonic concept of ideal form here, but anyone who's encountered Plato's account of the difference between individual instances of beds or tables, or the bits and reins for riding a horse, of which there are myriad, and Plato's notion of the idea of form of each, of which he claims there can only be one, the arguments about the relative values of the knowledge of makers of tables or beds, or riders of horses, or imitators in art, reflect some of the challenges I've set out for our understanding of instruments. Clarke tilts at the philosophical problem for a little, but he goes on to offer a pragmatic response to the challenge that we cannot know an ideal form directly, but must approach it through a process of discovery. And I like his account here because I think it helps us understand that group of objects we have there. Clarke draws on Michelangelo's use of the word dipendenza to express a relationship that binds and transcends the two forms of order embodied in the nude, the depiction and the geometry, and tries to find a language to show the way in which discovery of an ideal is gradual and shared. And this is Clarke. The ideal is like a myth, in which the finished form can be understood only as the end of a long process of accretion. In the beginning, no doubt, there's the coincidence of widely diffused desires and personal tastes of a few individuals, endowed with the gift of simplifying their visual experiences into easily comprehensible shapes. Once this fusion has taken place, the resulting image, while still in a plastic state, may be enriched or refined upon by succeeding generations. Or, to change the metaphor, it's like a receptacle into which more and more experience can be poured. Then, at a certain point, it is full, it sets, and partly because it seems to be completely satisfying, partly because the mythopoetic faculty has declined, it's accepted as true. If we take Clarke's perspective in relation to the cello at the beginning of the 20th century, the instrument presents a very special case, as perhaps the Steinway model D does today, but for very different kinds of reasons. The ideal violin never quite sets in the same way as the cello did in the 18th and 19th centuries. Francesco Maria Veracini, the great Italian virtuoso of the first half of the 18th century, owned many violins, including several Amatis, but his two favorite instruments were Steiners, from Tyrol rather than Italy, although he had been an Amati pupil. Although Giovanni Battista Viotti, later in the century, brought the Cremonese Stradivarian ideal to Paris and then to much of the rest of Europe, the early 19th century saw an alternative worldview embodied by Niccolò Paganini, playing the instrument he nicknamed the canon by Giuseppe Guarneri del Gesù. This kind of aesthetic differentiation, manifested in part by instrument choice, has remained present throughout the subsequent history of top-level violin playing. Guarneri's instruments are, in tonal terms, closer to a Brescian ideal, perhaps, than a Cremonese, so recalling Forsyth's distinction. I'm not going to say a word about setup today. It's irrelevant to this discussion. The greatest cellists, though, of the late 18th century and 19th century, by contrast, almost all had a preference for Stradivari's from roughly the first 2 decades of the 18th century. That's a very small pool of only about 20 instruments. A few of the names of the great players who chose those instruments will give some idea of the extent to which they were perceived as an ideal. Boccherini, Merighi, Pezzi, Piatti, Romberg, Becker, Haussmann, Davidoff, Servet. That gives you some sense of the geographical spread across Europe. But one instrument, which found its home in France, stands out. The Stradivari cello of 1711, named after Jean-Louis Duport, and later owned by Auguste Franquin, which was also the cello Rostropovich played from 1974 to his death. So it's had a very, very distinguished history. I think it's in a vault in Japan at the moment. Partly through Jean-Baptiste Vuillem's taking of this Duport instrument as the model for the vast majority of his cellos, and partly through its evocative power in the hands of great players, this became the foremost representative of the Stradivarian 19th century ideal cello. I'll come to this in a minute. There's no real equivalent for the violin or viola. Vuillem, for example, made a lot of different models of violins, with numerous examples of copies or responses to several Stradivari instruments, various copies and reinterpretations of Paganini's canon, and a significant number of Maggini-style instruments. In the performance today, I'm going to begin with one of Vuillem's interpretations of this ideal cello. However, it seems this particular archetype no longer appears to have the power that it once did. If we were to make a list of today's great players, the range of instruments in use is much wider than it was at the end of the 19th century, and I think it's only partially a consequence of scarcity of resource. In fact, even where a cellist like Yo-Yo Ma has the Davidoff Stradivari of 1712 to hand, more often than not, he chooses to play on other instruments. Perhaps today's ideal might be more likely found in Venetian cellos by Matteo Goffrilla and Domenico Montagnana, and it's a Montagnana that Ma plays most of the time. My hardly researched feeling is that Goffrilla, Montagnana and Guadagnini from Milan seem to provide the most common models that makers in this country are making today. There are considerably fewer Stradivari copies being made. The tonal balance of all of those instruments is rather different to Stradivari's, and there's a lot of variety in what you're going to hear today. So we cellists too now have agreed to have something closer to the violinist's aesthetic divergence. In their groundbreaking book on Stradivari from the very beginning of the 20th century, the then world experts on the violin family, the Hill brothers, repeatedly turned to the notion of an ideal form in their chapter on cellos, which begins with this striking assessment, or endorsement even. The excellence of Stradivari's violoncellos is even more remarkable than that of his other productions. In fact, we can unhesitatingly say that his finest examples stand without rivals. Posterity has not only admitted the correctness of his judgment, but re-echoes his triumph. One of the issues at the heart of this discussion is size, and Stradivari was by no means the first to try the kind of practical dimensions found in the ideal model. What the Hills are interested in Stradivari's work is described as a balance, again this Michelangelo idea, a balance of the maximum of power with the utmost refinement of quality, leaving nothing to be desired, bright, full and crisp, yet free from any suspicion of either nasal or metallic tendency. However, even 100 years ago, the Hills express a concern that perhaps this isn't always fully appreciated by players. And this is what they write. We're bound to recognize the growing tendency to subordinate or even sacrifice entirely beauty of quality to power of tone. A tendency perhaps even more apparent in relation to the cello than to the violin. The A or first string being the more easily rendered telling and effective, loud, the habit has been acquired of treating the violoncello for solo purposes as an instrument of one or at most two strings, the C or fourth string occasionally receiving some attention. Makers are therefore often obliged, often against their better judgment, to seek to adjust fine cellos in such a manner that the tone of the A string shall be above all aggressive and trumpet-like, that of the C string loud and metallic to the utmost degree. And they would never have heard a Spirocor, C or G. I think it's worth knowing that. The two middle strings are neglected. They cite a compositional example, which is the very beginning of Beethoven's first Razumovsky quartet, which begins with this beautiful melody on the second and third strings. And as you're about to hear, this is exactly the part of the cello that Michael Finnissy is interested in his Ricercaris too. The Hills chapter on Stradivari cellos is one of the great treasures of the literature for the way it brings their vast experience and knowledge of musicians as well as making to bear on the emergence of an ideal form. Everywhere one senses an interconnectedness and knowledge from first-hand experience that's difficult to achieve today. Simply, it's harder to have access to as much of the musical community as they did. They know they're charting the evolution of what they see as a perfect instrument, but they also seem keenly aware that this picture needs a much wider frame than Stradivari himself. And as they put it, whether or not Stradivari himself recognized the real superiority of these instruments over those of the past is highly problematical. We think he did not. Thus, the Hills are able to recognize Stradivari's supreme and highly individual craftsmanship, the extraordinary power of his imagination, his unique feeling for what Michelangelo might have called dipendenza, while also understanding that the things that make some of his work an ideal belong to a much wider cultural construction in which many elements take part. I'm now just going to say a couple of very brief things about the pieces and what we're doing here before we play. All of what I just said is a bit of a smokescreen. It's pointing us in one direction. We're now about to do something else. It's really an explanation for why I think an event like this that is drawing on an almost embarrassing surplus of instruments might have something interesting to say beyond just a comparison. From the moment Michael mentioned these pieces to me in a taxi in Bergen, I've been fascinated by the potential that a performance of them could have for making this idea of the instrument present and alive. So my introduction is really then just a reminder that it's easy not to be aware of the reach that instruments have in our musical world. They have this capacity to disappear. For those of you who don't already know some of Michael's work, and probably for some of you who do too, the music might come as a surprise. Michael's program note typically just suggests some of what might be going on. It's been one of the great experiences of my life to have had a long and ongoing relationship with Michael through my work with the Kreutzer Quartet. Zubin has now had a relationship for quite some time too. Some of the music we've played has been written for us, some for others, but every engagement with it, and with Michael personally, has taught me something new about what it is to be a musician and what art is. Half of me doesn't like the word taught because it suggests something of the schoolroom, but the other half feels very strongly that the revelation of something that we do not know is the highest goal of artistry. One of the challenges of Michael's music for performer and audience alike is that it asks for a kind of engagement that's quite different to habitual listening. The choice of the title Ricercari for these pieces is thus important. Although there is, on the one hand, a very clear sense of the core of the kind of cello that Michael is building in these pieces, and his interaction with some old repertoire is clearly an important part of that. On the other hand, I don't think these pieces are presenting or projecting something that can simply be observed. Instead, I think they kind of open possibility fields for things to be revealed. I won't say any more on that until we play. Just a quick bit of background for how we were set up. Michael made it clear it was my job to map cellos to pieces. I've spent 3 sessions with them prior to today. Each cello is being played as I found it, so not fitted up or set up as I might have it if I had it on loan for myself. We've only had them here since 1 o'clock today. First session was a quick playthrough in the workshop just to check that there were 7 instruments we could use that would work. We then had a workshop with Michael back in September with the 7 instruments we have there, which was fascinating, and there are lots of things from that we can talk about later. And then a rehearsal just now. Having made a rough list of possible instruments, Zubin and I met to rehearse, and we spent an afternoon working out which cello goes with which piece, which is one of the really interesting questions here. I'm not going to say anything about it. It was really easy, which surprised me. Zubin was quite vocal about things that weren't interesting to him, and we quickly moved from thinking about what might be viable to instead hunting for things that were curious or suggestive. I'm sure Michael will say some things afterwards, but the sources range from 17th century Italian cello music, which he's mentioned, through a Roman cantata, Bach, Beethoven, Dupont etudes, Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, Wagner's Siegfried Idyll, Max Reger, Berio, and of course Michael himself, who's everywhere, and I think a little bit especially at the end. There are 2 explicitly Stradivarian instruments. The viol I'm going to play on first, so I'm working in order, and the Gruber Zephyr, the Californian instrument, which is effectively a response to the Academy's Marquis de Corberon cello that Zara Nelsova used to play. The 2 17th century instruments have both been altered in size. The Brescian instrument, the Ruggeri, has been enlarged. It was initially quite petite, and the Ruggeri, that beautiful Cremonese one that is living currently up in the gallery, has been cut down. The Academy doesn't have a Venetian cello from the golden period in the collection, but I'm playing last on their Degani, which is from Venice. Perhaps the most interesting Academy link, and this is the very last thing I'm saying, is the cello by Forster, which is a very personal combination of a multi-body Steiner head. The cellos of both Old Forster, which is the one here, and his son had a staunch and powerful advocate in the great English cellist Robert Lindley, who was appointed the first cello professor of the Academy at its foundation in 1822. I haven't got time to sketch his enormous importance in this country, but it's pretty certain that this was one of the instruments he played.